This episode of the Quantum Space Innovating Trust podcast is brought to you in association with Vibu Systems, pioneers in software protection, licensing, and long-term digital trust. Quantum computing is no longer theoretical, and it poses a fundamental challenge to today's cryptography. Methods like RSA and ECC will not survive the quantum era. With its next code meter generation, Vibu Systems is already preparing a smooth, compatible transition to post-quantum ready security across hardware, software, and cloud licensing. Discover how CodeMeter is being engineered for the post-quantum future and why preparing early is the only safe strategy. Visit vibu.com/PQC today.
There was a time when digital systems were designed around people. Identity, access, and trust were all built on the assumption that a human sat behind every interaction. But that assumption is now breaking down. Increasingly, the internet is not people talking to systems, it is systems talking to other systems. APIs, bots, automated workflows, and now AI agents are generating a growing share of digital activity. Some estimates suggest the majority of internet traffic today is non-human in origin. The signals that our security, fraud, and identity systems rely on are still there, but they're no longer purely human. These are synthetic, automated, and often indistinguishable from legitimate behavior. This is sometimes called the dead internet problem. Not dead in the sense of broken, but dead in the sense that the assumption of a living human being on the other side of a transaction can no longer be taken for granted. And if that assumption is wrong even half the time, the trust stack that we've spent decades building may be operating on a corrupted foundation. And this changes how trust works. Decisions are still being made, enforcement is still happening, but the signals those decisions rely on are shifting. In this episode, we explore what happens when the behavioral data that underpins trust becomes unreliable, and why observability, the ability to see what is actually happening inside complex systems, is becoming one of the most critical and under-examined layers of the modern trust stack. My guest today sits at exactly that layer and has spent his career building the infrastructure that tells organizations what is actually happening across their digital environments at a scale most people never have to think about. Introducing Todd Persen, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Hydraulics, where he oversees product engineering, site reliability engineering, and the office of the CTO. Todd's core expertise is in building distributed systems and high-performing engineering organizations, particularly in and around observability. Todd is a seasoned engineering leader and repeat founder with a track record of building category-defining products. He was co-founder and CTO at Influx Data, where he led the creation of InfluxDB, the world's most popular open-source time series database, and one of the foundational tools of the modern observability revolution. He later co-founded Era Software, which built a high-performance log management system that was acquired by ServiceNow in 2022. Prior to Hydraulics, Todd has also served as principal engineer at Pivotal, where he was subject matter expert on observability initiatives spanning the company's pre- and post-IPO periods. Hydraulics is a real-time data platform for internet-scale operations. The company enables organizations to ingest, store, and query petabyte-scale data in real time at a fraction of traditional cost. Todd, thanks for speaking with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
As automated systems, APIs, and AI agents begin to dominate digital interactions, the signals that security, identity, and trust frameworks depend on are shifting. Now, from where you sit in the infrastructure layer, what do you think the ratio of human to machine-generated traffic actually looks like today, and how has that shifted in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think we still haven't hit that point where we have more machine traffic than human traffic. I would guess we probably are still somewhere around 2-to-1, human traffic to automated traffic. And it certainly depends on exactly how you categorize that. But I think, over the last 5 years, it's been a relatively slow growth. When we start to look at the last, 6 to 12 months, I think we've started to see a pretty significant rise in the amount of traffic that's being driven by agents and bots. And so I think we're getting to the point where we can kind of predict that kind of unity relationship where we start to see agentic traffic take over human traffic. And I think probably within the next 6 to 12 months, we'll get to a place where that's feasible and we start to see that take over. And I mean, I think the foundational models that people are building their agents and bots on are getting better and better every few months. And so I think we have kind of a Moore's law thing going on where the technology is improving rapidly right now. And we're going to start to see more places where agentic and bot traffic become standard and start to take over.
Let's talk a little about observability as a foundational layer. Where would you think observability sits in relation to things like security or identity? And is it a foundation that those systems rely on, or is it something that happens alongside them?
Yeah, so I think when you look at security broadly, we kind of have this perspective that we've been talking about at Hydraulics for a while now, that a lot of security tools and platforms are really just sophisticated log management tools. They're doing more than just storing logs and giving you a tool to look through them. They've got systems that are either looking for specific threat patterns, either using specific data sets, looking for exploits. But a lot of it, at the end of the day, boils down to taking logs from many different systems, putting them in a place where security teams can look for, identify, and remediate threats. And I think, in my view, that's really just an extension of observability. You're just doing less of the metrics and traces pieces, those kind of like two other traditional pillars of the observability stack. And I think it centers a lot around logs. And so I think whether you're looking at security use cases, authentication, authorization use cases, I think it's very, very tightly coupled to kind of what we consider modern observability.
Would you say that many organizations have a truly accurate picture of how much of their environment is driven by automated systems rather than humans?
Unfortunately, I'm going to say no. I think a lot of companies struggle with understanding where their traffic is coming from, and I think certainly with the quality of the agents that are being built right now, it's actually quite difficult to truly detect, what's human traffic, what's automated traffic, and I think it's just going to get more and more difficult as time goes on. Historically, writing scripts to pull data from a website or e-commerce platform or something like that it was relatively easy to spot either highly repetitive behavior or consistent timings between requests, repeat headers and things like that I think made it easy to identify traffic that was most likely automated. And now, the quality of the agents that are being built is so good and the models are so good that you can ask, Claude or Codex to build you something that has, sort of simulates human timing or has a highly sophisticated level of randomness between requests. And I think, the average person can do that. Whereas before, that was something that would have taken quite a bit of skill to do. And so I think we're starting to see traffic patterns that are, very difficult to distinguish between human versus bot or agent traffic. And I think that's something that most companies were and still are unprepared for, because that change happened so quickly.
If automated systems are producing some of this new behavioral data that security and identity platforms train on, is there a risk we're building trust infrastructure on a fundamentally corrupted baseline?
I think the upside is that we've whether you look at observability in general, or logs in particular, we've been building infrastructure for the last 25 years or so. I would say if you go back to Splunk, they started in 2001, 2002, around that time period. And, we've seen these order of magnitude shifts many times for these systems. And, you mentioned some of the projects I've been involved in, and, we've gone from, seeming like a few gigabytes a day was a lot of logs. And now, we regularly see companies doing hundreds of terabytes a day. And so I think, the infrastructure that we've built and the patterns that we've used to build these systems are actually pretty well suited to be able to scale to the level that we're going to need to keep producing observability systems that can support this rising growth. So I think, for better or worse, we're prepared for it. And I think we've been spending a lot of time making these systems something that we can foresee scaling to support this workload.
That's interesting, Todd, but let me ask this. Do you think there's a threshold or a tipping point in the ratio of automated to human activity where behavioral analysis stops being reliable as a trust mechanism?
Well, I think we probably, in some degrees, we've already gotten to the point where certain types of analysis have gotten difficult given the volume of logs. I mentioned multiple hundreds of terabytes a day. Like that's so much more data than any human can feasibly sift through, even with powerful tools. So there's already been a bit of a shift towards automation, building machine learning models that are capable of doing some of this anomaly detection for us. And so I think even if we see another order of magnitude rise in traffic, I think the thing that we'll continue doing is just building better and better systems that are either doing pre-storage filtering or looking for trends and patterns up front, and just keep building more sophisticated ways of kind of going through that data in an automated way. So, there's always a bit of a shift architecturally as we kind of hit these order of magnitude changes, but I don't feel like there's anything in the near future that's going to cause the fundamental models to break down.
When that observability infrastructure is either weak or absent, what assumptions do you think organizations are likely making that, in your honest opinion, is just simply wrong?
I think if you don't have a relatively sophisticated observability platform at this point, you really don't have a good sense for what's actually going on in your infrastructure. That may be somewhat obvious, but I think it means that all of your business decisions about, how your systems are driving, user value, how much you're spending on infrastructure, the return on infrastructure investment. There are a lot of things that you're blind to. And I think as a result, your organization is just not going to be able to effectively make decisions about technology infrastructure. And I think it dovetails with the questions you've been asking, which is basically, if you can't tell whether your infrastructure is healthy, and you don't have visibility into that, how are you going to be able to tell when your traffic starts to be, predominantly taken over by bots or agents? How are you going to find malicious actors? How are you going to remediate those threats? And if there's an incident, what are you going to do to actually find out what happened? So I think certainly, observability has become a necessary part of every well-functioning organization at this point.
We've spoken briefly about entering this era of AI agents. Now, if we are entering this new era and there are so many AI agents that autonomously call APIs or execute transactions or interact with other systems, how does that change the identity and observability challenge compared to, let's say, conventional bot traffic?
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about, there's obviously a a new layer of sophistication with some of these more modern agents that are being built. They're capable of doing a lot more and being able to be asked to do a lot more quickly. And there are some things going on, like some know your agent strategies, where we're trying to find ways to bring some sort of identity to these agents in a way that we didn't really see with previous types of bots. And I think the interesting thing is that we seem to be, as a I don't know, technology society, accepting that agents are a force for positive change in a way. We're looking at them becoming more like approved actors in some of these use cases. And I think what's interesting there is that, when we look at broadly at how humans have been consuming systems, we've been spending a lot of time on user interfaces, obviously like JavaScript, TypeScript in the browser. Those have been things that we've spent a lot of time over the last 10 to 20 years to optimizing and improving. And a lot of that stuff doesn't matter nearly as much for agents. They would probably, be much easier just to wrap everything around APIs. And so I think one of the things we will see shift is, maybe less energy goes into building human consumable user interfaces and more energy goes into building some of these, authentication authorization mechanisms, whether it's for agentic commerce or for other agentic workflows. We've already seen things like MCP has become adopted very rapidly. And so I think we're going to start to see a shift away from some of these more heavyweight interfaces. And I think we're going to see, more adoption by lighter weight APIs and agents that I think that also is going to shift the nature of traffic and the nature of how these systems interact.
I'm always interested for these type of systems where responsibility and accountability actually plays its main role. So, for instance, if a security or an identity system makes a decision based on corrupted telemetry, who do you think should carry accountability? Is it an engineering team? Is it the platform vendor or security tool leadership? And what's been your experience?
I think it's, in a lot of ways, it feels like at the end of the day, it almost always ends up coming back to engineering, building and designing these systems to be able to support, if it's corrupted telemetry, building tools and safeguards to kind of stop or limit that behavior. But I would say it's becoming more, I think the interesting thing about these agentic workflows and observability in general is that it is becoming more cross-functional. And I think, we talked a little bit already about how security platforms, security products are already heavily reliant on logs. And so I think there's already been a bit of a, union between engineering and security, making sure that tools are emitting telemetry that security teams can use to do their assessment and analysis. And I think we'll see, really continued partnership between those two teams, security and engineering, kind of figuring out, if you make a bad decision, how do you remediate that? And I think this is going to be something we struggle with for a while, which is around, the balance between allowing traffic through, which I think has sort of been the default rule, and potentially mitigating or blocking traffic based on, either unauthorized bot access or things like that. Because, if we look at, we've heard anecdotally of companies that have seen massive spikes in infrastructure bills due to bot traffic and things like that. And so companies are going to have to make these decisions about, do they block more strictly and try and block anything that looks like a bot or an agent, or do they sort of continue to keep things more open and just assume that things are less malicious. And so I think we'll keep finding that balance within organizations depending on the nature of their product, the nature of the service that they're putting out there for users, and kind of where security and engineering teams want to strike that balance.
You've also spoken about infrastructure and observability starting to scale, and I find it very interesting in practice because you've supported environments like the Olympics and the Super Bowl, these events generating hundreds of millions of interactions in a very, very compressed window. Now, what does the signal picture look like under that kind of load? And do regular systems assumptions hold in that case?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way around it. When you have these really high scale events, we work with a lot of CDN logs and kind of edge logs in general. But when you've got an event like, like you said, the Olympics or the Super Bowl, it's easily, upwards of a petabyte a day worth of traffic, like on that order. And sometimes it's for short periods of time. The Super Bowl's limited to a few hours. The Olympics is obviously over a much longer period of time and has spikes. But I mean, that's part of the thing I was commenting on previously, which is that we are able to support that kind of load, and we are able to build systems that can scale to that level. Fortunately, right now, there aren't many companies that are really operating at that pace consistently, day over day, doing multiple petabytes a day of traffic. There certainly are some. There are a few out there, but it's not the standard. Like normally we see much slower continual traffic volumes with spikes. Black Friday is another big one. We see e-commerce traffic spike significantly, and obviously payments and things like that go up. And so we'll continue to see these signals increase with agentic traffic. But I do think we do have kind of a vision towards the future, knowing that, even before agentic traffic became a concern, we were already forecasting relatively significant, year over year log growth. That's always been a pretty consistent factor. So that may shift a bit. We may see it accelerate, but I think we're still prepared. And I think some of those events, again, like Olympics and Super Bowl, have done a really good job kind of preparing us for the scale that we can predict in the future and having some good assumptions to model around.
What do you think organizations typically get wrong when they try and build observability into their security or identity stacks? What's the most common and consequential mistakes that they make?
I think one that we've historically seen is that companies will spend a lot of money on systems that either have a limited time horizon for storage, either using things that can't keep enough data or can't scale to a point where they can store all of their traffic. And so they'll make the decision to not store everything, or they'll leave certain things out. And that's one of the places where, we at Hydraulics do a lot of work. I mentioned with CDN and edge logs, which are, notoriously very, very high volume, can be very noisy. Again, we're seeing really everything at the edge, human agent traffic, whether it's good or bad traffic. And I think it tends to be and can be very expensive if organizations don't plan for it correctly. But the other piece that we're seeing is that with that data, you can make a lot of these decisions about how you model your traffic, what kind of data you block, starting to look for some of these patterns that are identifiable as bot traffic. And so I think once you kind of go down the path of not storing everything, not observing everything, it becomes very, very difficult to kind of come back from that. And then you realize that you've got these data gaps that can be very useful if you find yourself in the middle of a security issue or an outage. And, once that happens and you realize the data's not there, the data's not there. And so I think, finding a way as an organization to make sure that you've got visibility into all of the systems and that you plan accordingly for cost and feasibility of storing all that data. And, again, like I said, there are companies out there doing multiple petabytes a day. That's certainly not anywhere close to what most organizations do. So I think if you plan for it and you use the right tools, it certainly is possible to store all of that data for a decent amount of time that gives you the insights you need. But you gotta start from first principles and make sure you're adopting systems that meet your needs.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you there. But today's current stack was basically built for human majority internet. Do you really think that with all these changes that we should be thinking about building from the ground up, or can it be easily adapted and scaled?
I think we touched on this a little bit already, but I do think we've built systems that are largely going to scale. And again, I think the traffic volume may go up, in terms of number of requests. But I think we're still looking at, systems that I think are going to be able to support the workload. And if anything, we'll see, I kind of mentioned this a little bit already, but, a user requesting a single web page could easily pull hundreds of assets. And if you're looking at, web logs or CDN logs, and you're looking for each individual request made by a browser, that's a lot. It's a lot of individual request lines if you're looking, if each one of those is recording a log, whereas maybe an agent is just making a single API request to get the data that it needs. And so we may end up finding that agent traffic ends up being higher as an overall request rate over time, but we may find that the individual requests are actually lower volume or can be more concise. And so my guess is that for a while, at least, we're not going to see a sudden shift in traffic that causes things to break. But I think what we will see is that a change in the way that traffic looks, change in the way people work with that data. And, I think the current systems that we have are largely still going to be effective as this scales. And, everybody underestimates, there's a saying, like, I think people are bad at predicting things in the short term and good in the long term. So I think we have a pretty good sense for where things are going. I think we're going to see a lot of relatively interesting changes over the next, certainly the next couple of years, 3 to 5 years. But I think at the end of the day, I think we've done a pretty good job building infrastructure that's going to support us. And, until we come up with a different paradigm, we're essentially making agents do the same things that people were doing all along. They're still kind of operating within the same models. They're still driving the same browsers. And I think we'll see that shift. It'll change. And I think agents will start to become their own, own form of actor that looks a lot less like they do right now. But, I think, like I said, we've been building systems that scale for a very long time. And I think we've done a good job setting ourselves up and getting ready for whatever's coming.
We've talked about platforms being held accountable for the behavior their systems produce, and those decisions increasingly rely on behavioral signals. Now, the data that you're capturing doesn't just describe what's happening. It could become evidence of what has actually already happened. Do you see a future where observability data moves from an operational insight into something perhaps more evidentiary?
I think the answer is yes. I feel like we've been wanting for things to be more evidentiary for a while. I do think that we're moving towards a world where, we've done a pretty good job of using observability, again, to drive operational insights. And, we talked a little bit about security, and I think there's some evidence-based analysis already going on there. But I do think that these same tools that are powering automated and agentic traffic are also going to be the same tools that help us start to make more novel insights about the traffic itself. And so, it's a really interesting time. There's no shortage of people saying that and talking about it. But I do think we're getting to a place where we'll start to see observability broadly start to drive some of these improvements that I think we've been looking forward to for a long time. And again, as I said a little bit ago, I think the nature of the traffic is going to change the way that we can potentially coerce agents into operating in certain ways and having certain frameworks in place that either are there for authorization. I think we also could potentially see some systems that unify the telemetry that these agentic systems emit. And so, things like open telemetry were great for kind of, observability 2.0 or 3.0, kind of however you want to define it. I think we'll see probably some sort of, more modern structure around how this observability data is generated. Maybe it'll be more consistent. Maybe it'll give us some richer insights. But I do think we'll see these behavioral systems continue to improve. And at the end of the day, our thesis for a while has been, you can't really do anything without the data. the first problem you need to solve for all of these observability systems, and where I've spent a lot of time just in my career, is like you just have to build the thing that could store the data, and then you can move up the stack from there. And so I think we've done a really good job building a lot of those critical foundations that allow us to store that data. And now, again, the speed of change and innovation happening right now is such that I think that data will start to open up more places where, and more opportunities for leveraging that data to make interesting insights and decisions, and start to make these systems much more sophisticated.
The reason I actually pulled that question in is that I've been following what's been happening with these bellwether judicial reviews that have been brought against Meta and Google recently. It makes me wonder that if at some point in the future you might see Hydraulic's role changing as you're building for observability. So do you think perhaps unintentionally in the future you might be building for auditing purposes?
Certainly, yeah, and I think that's it's a bit of a place where we already see that as a role of a lot of security platforms. But I think again, we built our product with the idea in mind that we want to be able to store everything. Some systems will move data off to cold storage, or they'll find ways to cull data that's not important. But I think when you start to think about your logs, across your entire infrastructure as a system of record, it's really, a very, very high volume, very noisy transaction log of everything that's going on within your infrastructure, both inside and at the edge. I certainly think that there becomes a place where that data does become a system of record that can either drive insights if you're training models or looking for patterns. They can become auditing, whether it's for security reasons, or even just going back to look for new things that you didn't even consider to analyze. And so we've, in the past, we've had customers that wanted to look at things like, we mentioned Black Friday as a big event. They kind of want to be able to look for certain trends or certain patterns like year over year. And so once you start to get to the point where keeping that data long-term in full fidelity as possible, you start to be able to do some of these things that are, either auditing or comparative that you didn't used to be able to do when you thought about logs as potentially this disposable short-term thing, which I think is sort of more of the lens that observability systems operate from, which is, I just need to know if my thing is healthy right now, if there's something that can help me troubleshoot bugs and increase MTTR. But when you start to think about it as a longer term, longer running, actually rich source of data, I think it changes the kind of way you think about and leverage your logs.
What's next for Hydraulics?
I think, I mentioned the value of having a solid platform. And I think that's something that we've spent, the last 7-8 years really building and getting right. I think, again, we see a lot of our customers are in the media, entertainment, e-commerce space. I think there's a lot that we're building right now that I think is going to support a lot of the things we talked about here. How do we start to help companies identify and mitigate bot traffic? Again, I do think there is going to be a lot more coming in agentic commerce and having a lot of these things built for monitoring and validating bots and agents. So I think our goal, like I said, kind of it from the observability landscape in general, is take this really powerful, high scale, low level framework for storing all this data and start to move further up the stack and build tools that allow us to leverage that data for better insights, leverage that data for remediation and feed into a lot of these security workflows. So just logs and internet scale telemetry at the heart, and then just really starting to take that and feed it into more of these systems that companies are starting to see an increasing need for as this agentic change is coming.
I think, Todd, that what's really come through in this conversation we've had is that observability is no longer just about keeping systems running. It's becoming the place where reality is actually recorded. And as we move into an environment where agents are generating traffic, making decisions, and interacting at scale, that record starts to matter in a very different way. Because if you can't distinguish between human and machine behavior, and increasingly you can't, then the integrity of that underlying data becomes the only thing you can rely on. And because at some point, the question stops being what happened and becomes, can you prove it happened? So it feels like platforms like hydraulics are moving closer to something more fundamental, not just operational insight, but a kind of system of record for what actually happened. And once you're there, whether intentionally or not, you're stepping into territory that looks a lot like accountability, audit, and ultimately evidence.
Yeah, I do think it's going to be an interesting shift. I think we're going to see this with a lot of different data systems in this era. I think are going to the value of them is going to shift depending on how close they are to the source of truth and how much that can be leveraged either by agents or in the process of supporting agents. So yeah, I think there's a lot in store for us. I think it's a really interesting time, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
It's a fascinating shift from observing systems to, in many cases, underpinning how these systems are understood, verified, and potentially challenged. Todd, thanks for joining us. This has actually been a really insightful look at where observability is heading as the nature of the internet itself begins to change. You've been listening to the Quantum Space Innovating Trust. I'm Steve Atkins, and as always, we'll continue to explore how trust is being built, tested, and enforced across digital systems. We'll be watching this space closely, and Todd, we'd very much like to have you back as this develops.
Sounds great. Thanks, Steve.
That was Todd Persen, CTO of Hydraulics. And my name's Steve Atkins, and you've been listening to the Quantum Space Innovating Trust.
This was The Quantum Space, Innovating Trust, produced and edited by Crown Communications.